Jung lays it out really well, talking about how most people think, well, I guess it's Freud, that the private unconscious, that's when you get down to the real matter.
The personal one.
Personal unconscious. But then there is the collective unconscious under that, and that's the basement under the basement. Right?
Yeah, yes.
And I'm just been thinking about it. Of course, I'm trying to use Jung for my own ideological purposes. That it's like the personal unconscious, that's the level of art. You go and talk about your own specific problems. And because they are very generally reflecting what is in the time, the problems in the time. And then you have the archetypal unconscious, which is the Kitsch level, where you start to go into something that is beyond.
You see, I disagree. I don't think the modernism is unconscious. I think it's
It's subconscious?
No, the modernism is the collective conscience.
Yeah.
No, sorry, not conscience, but the consciousness.
Yeah.
The collective consciousness. And Kitsch is more the collective unconsciousness. Because it is a sort of collective agreement that this is new, this is not, and this is exciting, this is not. So I don't think it's so much unconsciousness about it, actually. And I think it's funny that Jung, whom I respect a lot, he makes sort of the cardinal mistake when he, at least a few times, certainly his followers, picks out modernist paintings, for instance, to prove their point about the unconscious. Yeah. And a lot of those, for example, the what do you call it, the Dali movement, surrealism, for example.
Making this
it's a cardinal mistake because, oh look, it's surrealism and it's showing us an aspect of the unconscious. Yes, but it's showing it consciously.
Yeah.
So
it's saying this is subconscious.
Yes,
the
and
unconscious.
that is the mistake. If you're going to make paintings where you show the unconscious, you have to show it like the unconscious presents itself as a subcategory of the physical, but still present.
Yeah, but a little bit going to this hero's journey, that you go into the cave, you find that stone or that fire or that treasure there, and you bring it back into the light of consciousness, but you present it to the people in that town that you go back in an understandable way. So you have to translate in a way that unconscious and put a sort of a costume on it, so people could say, oh yeah, that's what the whole thing is about. And that's the thing that I do not completely understand from Jung, that his idea of this collective unconscious is sort of a amorphous or amount of information that comes into consciousness by shaping itself with images or archetypes, like the old wise man, the and so on, like or the God child and
the
things
mother.
like that.
It's
the mother.
It's certainly not exact the thoughts that he's dealing with, and I think that's quite admirable, because if you go back to Immanuel Kant, for example, he was the first philosophers who truly tried to have a systematic approach to metaphysics. And I think that was a big mistake. I think he muddled with something you shouldn't have muddled with there, because our metaphysics and our spirituality, or what Jung called the Weltanschauung,
How we look at the world.
Yes, it's the glasses we wear when we look at the world. To make it systematic is a mistake, because then you lose so much.
On that note, because there is something that is archetypes of the collective unconscious that I'm also trying to grasp. I guess it's the same thing that you were talking about, that he talks about what's the brother, a specific monk who had this vision, seeing God. Yeah. And he tries to recapture that in this mandala, and of course that it is transformed when he does that. But I'm still trying to understand if Jung is saying that, well, you need to translate it to make it understandable, because in itself it's too sort of horrible, too strong. And whether that's the thing you should do, or whether Jung is saying that sort of lessens it and makes it too politically correct and somehow. But you have to translate it somehow.
Yeah, but I think he says that by understanding it, you're already translating it.
Yeah.
That is what is happening because the unconscious presents itself in surprising ways and in ways we don't fully understand. And once we understand them, in that understanding, we're already translating it into words we understand and know.
Yeah. But the thing I don't completely understand that when it's presented, when an archetypical figure comes in a dream or in a vision or something like that, it's already the unconscious willing to take that shape in order for the conscious to understand it.
Well, that's
or it's me putting an image there so I can, okay, that's you, or that's this part of the unconscious.
Well, doesn't it talk about that in some way you cannot say that is an archetype or that is an archetype, because the archetype is behind those images, right?
Yeah, and you
so
never reach that.
That seems very much like what your father is talking about, this myth behind the myth, that has a local coloring in wherever it turns up.
Yeah, and of course it bears resemblance to Plato's ideas of forms, which sometimes they talk about that is clear inspiration, but there is a difference. Because Plato's ideas of forms are ideas in the universe that presents themselves in our world exact. But Jung's archetypes, they never present themselves exact. It's always in the fog.
Yeah, and Jung doesn't have a political agenda about establishing a totalitarian state.
But that's so interesting about how it presents itself, that it's always this unclear. And that is why I think that Jung is the great savior of spirituality in the 1900s, because he reintroduces a spiritual approach to the spiritual. And for example, Freud, he invented the subconscious, and that is basically just something that we don't want to deal with. It's the conscience. So we push it down into the cellar. So it's subconscious. But then, of course, Jung comes and says, no, it's not everything that presents that we present to ourselves, for example, in dream, that is repressed. Some things are just parts of us that is mystical and very, very broad and unclear in its meaning, and therefore he introduced the term unconsciousness. And of course Freud, he said that dreams are mystical because we're trying to hide the real thing it's trying to tell us, because we can't bear it. But then Jung says, no, the unconscious is mystical. You know,
it has nothing to do with your personal experience.
Well, it does though. It has with your personal experience, but it's a language that is so deep and emotional that it would, of course, not use the language we use in everyday life. That's his explanation.
But it takes the shape of the language that we use every day in order to come out and communicate.
But the way it presents itself is it doesn't present itself logical, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, like we have in real life, because sensations, it's part of sensations and inheritance. And that does not present itself logically. It presents itself according to what makes an impression and what is meaningful.
Yeah.
And that is a mess.
Yeah, it's a mess. It's a real mess.
And what really complicates and makes that a mess is that idea of when it talks about how people identify with their persona, their public mask. And I think that's me. So when these things show up from the subconscious, then that is, am I going crazy? This is not who I am.
Yeah, this is not part of me. I'm not that one.
So in that case, you could say that people are suppressing something, but that which they are suppressing is the contact with what is not specifically personal.
Yeah, but the difference, of course, Jung doesn't deny that you suppress things, but you know, Freud with his psychopathology and everything, he was just interested in looking at sickness.
That everything there is just repressed things that we don't like.
Yes, and let's study sick people, because I'm of course healthy, you know, it's that perspective. But Jung recognized that we're all sick, which means that we're all healthy. So he thinks it's interesting to study healthy people too, not just sick people. And it's the same with these old tribes with their traditions and strange rituals, strange beliefs. Freud and very many others viewed them as crazy, sort of
subhuman expression of something, like
yes,
on a second level.
And that is common theory today by, for example, I think Christopher Hitchens talked about that those primal people, they are only making a god system to explain the physical world because they don't have the advanced scientific approach that we do.
Speaking of, Freud being healthy, studying the sick people, I think that's something that Jung talks about, that, if I understood him correctly, he's saying that, yeah, the things that happen in your childhood, okay, that's fine to look at, but try to instead build something new, construct something. That's how you get out of it if you have some kind of problem. Don't sit and just look at what is so-called oppressed or repressed or whatever, but try to make something
out from it. Yeah. Like to make out something from that mud and that mess. You build up something and then you make a painting, a poem, or a story that could reflect that thing underneath.
Well, it's like in that case, it seems like Freud is more concerned with staring at the dragon, and that's sufficient. Yeah. But Jung has that idea of the hero's journey somehow of slaying that dragon and using it for something, and
But it's also Jung's willingness to go into the mystical unafraid, because psychology is mystical, and Freud, of course, he wanted it to become an exact science. That's why he called it psychopathology. Pathology is like exact studies of diseases, and we can use that on the psyche. And I think Jung really exposed Freud's intentions in his book, The Undiscovered Self, where he writes that he remembered that Freud said to him that the reason why he based his psychological findings on sexuality was because he was afraid that it would become like occult and mystical. And that is a very interesting statement, because it means that Freud did not follow his convictions, but made that decision at least partly based on fear of critique from the scientific community.
But then Jung also uses a scientific language or a scientific approach, talking about that thoughts and dreams are facts. They're not just, but they are facts that can be explained objectively. So he has a sort of a bringing an objective approach to this mystical and amorphous background.
And that's so funny when this Freud's free association technique with dreams, where Jung uses that because Freud is his teacher, and then Jung notices that, oh God, it's something wrong with this free association technique, because he noticed that when he was associating freely about the dream with his patient, or just the person who has come with the dream to him, he noticed that he was trying to get away from the dream with the free association technique. Yeah, that thing that happened in the dream, that reminds me of that and that. And then we are getting further and further away from the point of the dream. And why is that? Well, of course, because he doesn't want to get into the point of the dream, because it's frightening. So therefore, he developed this technique where you do not use free association, but you study the dream very exactly. And say that it tells us something that is important here.
So he's really talking about God and the gods, but he puts a name as collective unconscious or the self in order to be understandable for modern people. So he doesn't fall into the category of a mystic or a shaman or something.
I don't think Jung was afraid of that, though.
You don't think so?
No, it doesn't seem... Well, maybe a little bit. I mean, the book Man and His Symbols, I think the reason why he wanted to let most of his students and colleagues who were followers of him write the book, he only wrote the preface, was because he wanted them to really dive into the mystical. He didn't dare to take that step, to talk about Brother Grimm and those people. And
Well, you have in that book, which I guess was collected after, I mean, he wrote different essays, and it's collected in Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. And the second essay there, he goes through and he says something like, for those who think this is some kind of mystical idea, well, archetypes can just be regarded as names for our desires and drives. So fine. It's not more mystical than that. It's just a different name one.
Yeah.
But he makes a really interesting point in that first essay, Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, when he talks about how previously, when you had that sort of animistic worldview where nature was a reflection of our psychological state and these things, with the gods and how things were being animated. In such an age, you didn't have psychology because you didn't need it.
Well, you did though.
No, but his point is, not as a science in that sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Where he talks about how, if I've understood it correctly, he's saying that all those sort of problems and that we have in our head now were projected onto nature. So you could outsource your psychological problems.
Yeah, and you have all the theater and pantheon of gods.
Yeah. So it's not just me and my personal problems.
It was part of everyday life,
Yeah.
and that's the big catastrophe of modern day life, that these things are becoming more and more private. And Jung writes about it in Discovering the
Undiscovered Self.
The Undiscovered Self, that he notices that the modern man is beginning to look more and more like one of his patients. because he says that the typical neurotic patient is a man who has two sides of himself which are too divided. That is the issue, it's nothing else. And he, in order to become healthy, needs to make these two things which are not possible to bring together. The patient thinks they have to be brought together in order for him to become a whole man. And he's saying that the modern man's polarity between scientific knowledge and belief is getting wider and wider, because our beliefs are becoming more and more private and strange, because our spirituality is not it's not part of the public discourse. Then we should just be purely rational, scientific. And then we get this very private, strange belief, and we get this gap. And he was deadly afraid of this gap. And I think we can see it with all, psychological sicknesses are the norm. Yeah, it's the norm today.
Yeah.
And also what he's been talking, when he says that, speaking of the conversation we had on wokeness, the dark flame we had, how when this is suppressed, you have political and social movements signified by their complete lack of spirituality that take over, but of course satisfy some kind of grand goal.
They incarnate in a way that spiritual projection of the unconscious into a political sphere, and then it becomes this mess that we're
negative,
having today.
aggressive
demigods or sub-gods of COVID, and these people kind of making rules, and people say,
And Jung even compares the mass culture and the growing of the big states in the West to an archetype. He says they want to go back to the Garden of Eden.
The mother that provides shelter, food, and all this public welfare, and she will provide. So I do whatever she says. You go back to that archetype.
But then, of course, he says that in that process of fulfilling the Garden of Eden, we are not Adam and Eve, because we have eaten from the tree, the tree of knowledge. So it will end with the diminishing of the self, and we will become miserable individuals. Even though it's tempting with this all-governing state and gives us fruit and labor and all beautiful things.
So funny with Campbell talks about that, how the welfare state, it talks about it as this archetype of the all-encompassing mother. I will take care of you. It's just strangling you.
Oh God!
And that is sort of the paradox when I started reading Jung. That was so surprising, because he's uncompromisingly individualist, Jung. And it's like many places he writes, the individual is the only thing that exists. It's the only thing. The government doesn't exist. It's the individual. So he's the most anthropocentric philosopher I know about. Probably more anthropocentric than Ayn Rand and Stirner. But that was so strange that he writes that you can't use statistics on the individual. You have to use the individual. And individuals is not the rule, it's the exception. And how did this add up with his thought about universal archetypes? I found it so puzzling. And I haven't really found a conclusion yet, but I think it has something to do with the unconscious. That the unconscious is somewhat universal, but the conscious is not universal at all. When you meet a person and you meet with his conscience, it's an exception.
I mean, and if you in your daily life, I mean, your conscious just spots the light over like small things, like I'm taking the glass and I'm cleaning this and I'm moving the brush and so on. So it's totally individual, unaware of the totality. So, but then he brings this unconscious on the other side, like this kind of two polarities that you were talking. The unification of these two things, but the impossibility of bringing them together. And that's the thing that I'm always finding difficult when I'm reading Jung. That in the light of consciousness, he dives and he puts that light onto these unconscious elements, and it gives me a bit of a...
Yeah. There's one thing that might...
You're afraid of it,
Well, I do. I have to be honest there. When I see this vast spotlight over things that, what is the hell is this? I don't understand it. Or I've seen myself into this kind of process or that, and I was not aware of it. I was totally unaware of it. So then I realized how unconscious and irresponsible I am in my daily life. And then I see my work and you see all these faults, flaws here and there. And it's quite scary because it really makes you a bit vulnerable. Conscious about that thing that you cannot handle and control anymore. And that's quite, at least at me, it scares the hell out of me.
If you want to see the entire segment, head over to caveofapilles.com/subscribe and become a $5 patron today. Watch all our conversations or shuffle through the Cave of Apilles audio playlist by becoming a member today at caveofapilles.com/subscribe.